Well, over the past 40 years, since 1968, I've done many hundreds of interviews and media programs and lectures for colleges, universities, the United Nations, Voice of America, the State Department, the White House, the Congressional Record, and more recently, too many radio and TV interviews to mention whether, they could be National Geographic, History, Discovery channels, or our works with shows with German and Russian and United Kingdom programming. The books that I've written, America's Secret Destiny, Founding Fathers' Secret Society, and United Symbolism of America, have now been published in German, Russian, French, Spanish, Mexican, and Japanese. Boy, you should see that Japanese version. It's a gorgeous one. But even after all of that, it was not until the airing of History Channel's Secrets of the Founding Fathers that I encountered the greatest deception on this subject in my lifetime. Now, there were many in the media film world who agreed with me, and then they soon called me and asked me, hey, let's do something about this. Let's right some of the wrongs perpetuated by the new young Turks now in control at the History Channel. A few weeks back, we completed our interviews that will be aired in a 2-hour special again on Discovery Channel in America, but also it will be aired worldwide on a series of other networks, including, I believe it's A&E. It's called Finding the Lost Symbol. But tonight, we are spending time with the author of Solomon's Builders, Freemasons, Founding Fathers, and the Secrets of Washington, D.C., by Christopher Hodapp, who also wrote Freemasons for Dummies. Christopher Hodapp also appeared in a starring role in the History Channel's Secrets of the Founding Fathers and did a marvelous job in rectifying the numerous, and I mean numerous, mistakes that were made and gross exaggerations that made it in that very embarrassing production, which blackened the reputation of the History Channel and for which they lost a great deal of credibility. Solomon's Builders relates the true stories of these visionary founders and the fascinating meaning behind the cryptic codes, enigmatic symbols, and intriguing architecture that is reputedly the basis for the sequel to the Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown's forthcoming novel, once called The Solomon Key, now renamed as The Lost Symbol. Welcome to 21st Century Radio, Christopher Hodapp.
Great to be here, Bob. Thanks for having me.
Well, certainly enjoyed your performance there on History Channel. I think we were...
you really have not overstated the damage that show really did, and that's a real shame because the people that started out making that really did have the best of intentions, and the wheels really fell off of it, and that was a real shame.
Yeah, I don't think we're speaking out of turn when we say what happened, friends, was a new group of young Turks, I mean, really young Turks in the old sense, came in, and they really did change the philosophy of the History Channel. Now, your assessment of the latest 2-hour production of the History Channel's Secrets of the Founding Fathers, which you just passed on to us, do you think my major concern were over some real basic things there, Christopher. One was an interpretation of Novus Ordo Seclorum, which anyone who has studied Latin knows is this new order of the ages.
Exactly.
And they refused. They refused to consider that and called it the New World Order several times. Whoa, boy, you talk about blatant errors. That was just the beginning, though.
Well, and right down to the sort of dumb pronunciation of the word Masonic as Masonic. Immediately, it's like someone saying nuclear. It's the whole thing really left a bad taste in everyone's mouth. And you're not kidding when you say it's a new regime at the History Channel, because there is anyone who has watched the History Channel over the last 2 years has seen the major change that has gone on in terms of the basic philosophy of programming there. So it's been, the schedule is now dominated by ice road truckers and Monster Quest and a world without people and this kind of thing. And the people there are very proud of what they've done, because they took their demographic that for a dozen years was people in their late 30s to their 50s, usually men, and they've dragged that demographic down so that it's now mostly 18 to 24 boys and young men, and that's the demographic that they really want to get. And they've done that by doing this kind of programming. So when the initial rough cut was delivered of this show, the History Channel's answer was, nope, not enough sex, drugs, and rock and roll in that. Take it back and fix it. They literally did that. So as a result, you have like the head of the American Hemp Museum sitting there going, dude, all the founding fathers smoked dope and they wrote the Declaration on hemp, and this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Or having little old ladies making testicle jokes,
I couldn't believe that one.
I couldn't either.
Oh, and what they did to George Washington.
And then, of course, naturally, you can't be part of the A&E umbrella of networks without having ghost hunters in your show, so they crammed that in as well, setting up an infrared camera one night in the Hellfire Caves under Dashwood's estate in England, and when a moth flew by the infrared camera, they go, there it is, there's the spirit of Benjamin Franklin, proof positive that Franklin was a member of the Hellfire Club and roamed these caves.
Yeah, that's pretty
yeah.
Well, okay, let's get on with it, with your wonderful book. Friends, look, I've read a lot of books in this area, but the way this book stands out, I think, I'm going to quote, there is a saying that I used to love. Oh, yes, that was Thomas Jefferson that said it when he wrote his little booklet, well, what ended up being called the Jefferson Bible. But as he said, the words of Christ in the Bible stand out like diamonds in a dunghill in comparison to what all of the other interpretations of everybody else who decided to get in on the act. And there are so many good chapters. Your history, I learned a good deal from this book, and I love learning. This was fun. You write so well. It's clever, and it's funny, and I couldn't help but laugh a lot. I mean, and I enjoy stuff like that a great deal. So congratulations. This is a really good, readable book. This is the kind of book, literally, that should be in every school. Because you will find out things about not just the major founding fathers, but other founding fathers we're going to touch on later on that you just don't find anywhere else. So great going there. Now, you note that Dan Brown left clues on the dust jacket of the Da Vinci Code as to what his next book would be about. What kind of clues you're talking about?
Yeah, back when the original hardback edition of Da Vinci Code was published in, what's it been now? 2003, 2004. The cover of the dust jacket had a series of numbers and figures all over it, but some of the numbers, there were longitude and latitude of the CIA headquarters in McLean, Virginia, and not just CIA headquarters, but specifically of a very famous sculpture that's sitting outside of the CIA headquarters called Kryptos, which is a giant copper scroll that the artist has. He put it there so that professional government code breakers who walked by it every day had a puzzle to try and solve. And it's been sitting there now for I don't know, 15 years or so, and they have not yet solved all of the code in it. So that was one of the clues that it was going to be in the Washington area. The other biggest clue was that if you opened up the original hardback of Da Vinci Code and you read the inner flaps of that, if you looked very carefully, certain letters were actually printed darker than others. And if you wrote all those letters down in proper order, it said, "Is there no help for the widow's son?" Which is a phrase that's important to Freemasons. And then very shortly after the publication of Da Vinci Code, when Dan Brown was still talking to the world and talking to the press, he said that the book would be about the Masons in Washington, and the Masons would be pretty happy with it because there was so much misinformation out there about them, and his novel would address some of that misinformation.
Well, let's hope so.
We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. Right. Yeah.
We'll see.
And now that his books have already sold 80 million plus, and just about the major media is really focused on this. So sometime in September, I think everybody in the world will have heard about that particular book.
September 15th is the date that's burned into the mind of every bookstore owner and publisher, and that's the day that it gets released. It's being handled like a Harry Potter release, so that at 12:01 you can get your book, and Amazon is promising they're going to deliver the book by September 15th for anyone who's purchased it prior to that date. So it is a huge, huge publishing event. No matter what you think of Dan Brown's books and his writing style and his plots, there are people that sniff that they don't like his books and they don't like his stories, and they don't like his writing style. That's fine. That's fine. 81 million people obviously did, or okay, let's say 20 million of them didn't like it after they bought it. Okay, so 60 million people obviously did. This is a huge, huge event, and the initial print run is going to be like 6 million copies just for the initial hardback.
But your book was not written to second guess Brown's sequel, but to separate the truth from fiction. Now, tell us a little bit about that. What kind of fiction do you find? And because I like to read his stuff because I'm enjoying it. I can find all kinds of mistakes in it as far as I'm concerned, but that wasn't the reason. That wasn't the reason why I got it.
Well, exactly, and it's funny because I've sort of been trying to get the Masonic world on my blog to take note of this and say, whether you agree with it or not, whether you like his book or not, whether you think they'll be coming and knocking on the door of your lodge for the right reasons or not, people are going to stand up and notice this fraternity in a very, very big way. And their preconceived notions are going to be based on what Dan Brown writes in his book. So you better get used to the idea that they're coming and knocking on doors, and they may not be armed with the proper information. I'm a big believer in getting as much truthful information out about the Masonic fraternity as possible. I've been criticized by some saying you're destroying the fraternity by taking the mystique and the secrecy away from it. I disagree. I disagree.
I disagree with that totally, because I don't think those who are so deeply into the real philosophy and beliefs of Freemasonry and what they're working on would necessarily feel that way. Because
this is if you join a Masonic lodge thinking that it's going to provide you with the secrets of life, the universe, and everything, and be filled with all this mysticism and super secret symbolism that suddenly the heavens are going to open up and you'll know the secret of the universe, it isn't going to happen. That's not what happens in a Masonic lodge. That isn't what Freemasonry was designed to do.
Well,
there have been people over the centuries that have tried to make it that and tried to add those things to it, but that's not really what the philosophy of Freemasonry is.
No, it isn't. I think, as you repeat many times, to make good men better is quite an important goal. We'll touch on that much later in our interview. Hey, we got to take our first break here, and when we return, we're going to talk about why was the creation of the United States different from any other nation, with our guest, Christopher Hodapp, the book Solomon's Builders, Freemasons, Founding Fathers, and the Secrets of Washington, D.C., Ulysses Press. Now, there's a name for you. John Lennon would be proud of that. Hodapps, HODAPPS.com. Hodapps.com.
Hello, folks. This is Peter Rowan. You're listening to 21st Century Radio with my dear friend Bob Hieronimus. Thanks for listening.
Our guest is Christopher Hodapp. The book is Solomon's Builders, Freemasons, Founding Fathers, and the Secrets of Washington, D.C. Ulysses Press. And go to hodapps.com, HODAPPS.com. gmail.com. Okay, did you study up for this next question?
Sure.
No. All right. Okay. All right. Now, for a free trip to Hawaii. Okay, you got to answer this correct. You win free trip to Hawaii. Why was the creation of the United States different from any other nation?
Because they started with a blank slate. Because it occurred during the height of the Enlightenment period, where the rest of the world was in a pitched battle over those who believed that monarchs and popes should had a divine right to rule and should stay in power, and the Enlightenment thinkers thought nothing of the kind, and so it was a harmonic convergence of all of these movements happening, all these philosophies happening, and ideas of scientific change, and so you had a group of men who came together at that specific point in time that were able to actually put this great experiment into practice and say we're starting from scratch. So that's what made the United States different.
It sure did. Now, you resisted writing this book at first, but you changed your mind. How did you change your mind, or why?
It was an interesting incident. I was still talking with the publisher and wasn't sure that I wanted to go and do this project. And I went to a gathering one night of young Masons and felt thoroughly out of place since I was about 10, 15 years older than the rest of them. And one of them had brought his father, and he was a man who had fled Romania and in the 1960s when Romania was still under a dictatorship and largely controlled by the Soviet Union. And he told me he had read about the Freemasons in Tolstoy's War and Peace. There are extensive passages in War and Peace that talk about one of the characters joining a Masonic lodge, and conversations that he has with an older man who's a Mason before he joins. And he said, I'd read about the Freemasons in War and Peace, and I dreamed of the day that I would be able to join a Masonic lodge. And so I fled Romania as a young man in the 1960s, escaped the country, came to New York, and as soon as I became a U.S. citizen, I decided to join a Masonic lodge. Freemasonry can't exist in a society that isn't free.
Well, you must be psychic, because that's my question. That's my question. The question was, I'll hold it up to the microphone. There it is. Why is it that Freemasonry can only exist in a free country? And you just started so why? Why is that?
Because Freemasonry espouses free will. The greatest thing that the designers of what became modern Freemasonry did was they said, if you bear in mind when modern Freemasonry began, which it was in 1717 in London, you had just come out of a terrible period in England. Nobody talks about the English Revolution, but there really was an English Revolution where they were back and forth on the argument between Protestant and Catholic and who was going to how the government was going to be run. They deposed and killed the king. Charles II then came back and agreed to great restrictions on the monarchy. So they had just come out of this terrible. It was a 200-year period of religious and political strife where you could literally do nothing but sit in your house over a 30-year period and either be a loyal citizen or a traitor without changing any of your religious or political views. Mm-hmm. It just depended on who was in power at the time. And so when men came together in 1717 to form Freemasonry, they said, there are two things in this country that are getting people killed after an argument: fights about religion and fights about politics. So let's not discuss any of those things in a Masonic lodge.
That's right.
And they created a situation where men from every walk of life could come in, high-born or low-born, no matter what religion they were, no matter what their political beliefs were, and they could come together in a Masonic lodge and meet on the level as equals. Didn't care if they were a member of the royal family or a shopkeeper, and just meet as men and brothers. And so it was this very egalitarian concept.
Well, I just also want to note something you wrote on page 8. Freemasonry was outlawed at that time in Romania, just as it has been outlawed all across. Listen to this, friends. The Soviet bloc, Hitler's Germany, Mussolini's Italy, Khomeini's Iran, and Hussein's Iraq. What does that tell you right there, friends? What does it tell you? It's not has nothing in common with dictators.
Exactly.
Nothing at all. As a matter of fact, the first thing they do is get rid of them if they possibly can, in one way or the other, by almost.
Now, I will tell you the one exception to that is Castro's Cuba, and it's a very interesting reason why. The Freemasonry still flourishes in Cuba. The Castro regime has never tried to shut down Masonic lodges, and that's because before Castro came to power, during the beginnings of the revolution there, Freemasons hid him in one of the Masonic lodges, and he never forgot that, and so he never outlawed Freemasonry in Cuba.
Well,
but it's literally the only situation where you have a true dictatorship going on, where the first thing they did was outlaw Freemasonry.
Yeah. Now, you have some wonderful definitions of Freemasonry. Would you define Freemasonry for us, please?
Sure. My elevator speech on Freemasonry is simply that it's the world's largest, oldest, and best-known men's fraternal organization. Mythically, it's descended from the builders of King Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem. And the modern fraternity is believed to have developed from the craft guilds of European stonemasons who built the castles and the cathedrals during the Middle Ages. Modern Freemasonry uses the tools and the symbols and the terminology of medieval Masons as an allegory for building temples in the hearts of men.
Well, I also love what you had on page 19. I'm quoting you were quoting the Farmer's Almanac in 1823. A Freemason would be just if there were no laws, human or divine, except those written in his heart by the finger of his Creator. In every climate, under every system of religion, he is the same. That to me, I find that extremely impressive. I know that when I think we all go through a period in time which we are atheists, and then you come to grips with things. But one of the things I enjoyed about certain well-educated atheists is that by and large they would be ethical, regardless of whether they believed in the deity or not. It's right human relations there. Now.
It's something I find interesting about that quote from the Farmer's Almanac, and I use that quote many times talking to people and saying I find it interesting that at that period of time, the early part of the 1800s, that was stuck in the Farmer's Almanac because everybody in those days, everybody in society knew who and what the Freemasons were and what they stood for. Mm-hmm. They were a common organization on the community's landscape. They were when a town or village started as the United States expanded. The first two buildings that were usually built were the first church and a Masonic lodge, And that kind of awareness of Freemasonry existed all the way up until about the 1960s. And then beginning in the 1960s, our age group, the baby boomers, decided that they wanted to pretty much reject everything that their fathers did, and you couldn't get much more establishment than the Freemasons. Mm-hmm. And so you now have a situation of 2 generations later of, you say Freemasonry to most people, and they give you, long lizard-like blinks like they were talking to an insurance salesman. I go, what's a Freemason? I don't know what those are. And it's been an enormous change in a very short period of time.
Well, of course, there were some founding fathers, very important founding fathers that were Freemasons. What was the effect of Freemasonry on George Washington?
George Washington had a fascinating life. We know him as the hero of the Revolution, but he had a fascinating life prior to that. In the 1750s, he turned 21. His father had died, his older brother had died, and suddenly he inherited all of his property that had belonged to his family. And at the same time, his older brother, his brother had been more educated than he has, and he always had sort of an inferiority complex. And suddenly, at the age of 21, he's thrust into being a very important person in Virginia society. It's sort of thrust upon him. And so in the 1750s, at the age of 21, shortly before he goes off as a member of the Virginia militia, he decides to join a Masonic lodge in Fredericksburg. And throughout the rest of his life, there are not any more than about 9 documented situations that we can absolutely for certain say that he attended a Masonic lodge meeting. There were certainly more. There were undoubtedly more than that, but there are only 9 that we can actually document. And yet, all through his life, he continued to publicly proclaim that Freemasonry had a profound effect upon his attitude. Washington was a just and upright man to begin with. It isn't that Freemasonry took a rough and tumble ignorant slob and turned him into a virtuous hero of the nation, but he always said that it had a tremendous and profound effect upon him. And he encouraged, during the Revolution, in particular his generals. An overwhelming number of his generals during the Revolution became Freemasons at his request. Freemasonry was very important to him all throughout his life.
Yeah, I think it was 33 of his generals, which, there's a lot of other theories about this, friends. I mean, I've heard, and certainly you noted this in the book, that some are referring that every general was, or almost everyone, and this is one of the important things about your book. When you say something, it is credible and believable because of your research and documentation, which unfortunately my dear friend, and he was a dear friend of mine, Manly Palmer Hall, God bless his soul, but he wrote many of his books about Freemasonry before he became a Freemason.
Yeah. And
they did the same situation kind of that Albert Pike went through, and of course you're bound to make very big mistakes, and they did.
Yeah, and it's a shame because Manly Hall has such a huge breadth of work and is such an important figure on so many levels. And yet, so much of what he wrote, I hate to say it, were lifted from other sources.
Correct.
Without attribution. He would just say it. The one of the most famous is his contention that this shadowy character called the Professor showed up when Ben Franklin and a committee from Congress were designing the first colonial flag in 1775, and they go to this unnamed person's house, and they meet with George Washington, and this shadowy figure called the Professor shows up and gives them guidance on the flag, and then he shows up again at the ratification of the Declaration of Independence. And Hall just repeats this stuff, which was just out of a pamphlet from a Rosicrucian organization that was published in the 1800s, and he just repeats it as this is what happened. Yeah,
it's the same thing about the flag and the Great Seal. As a matter of fact,
he did
the same thing with that. But I have high regard for him. But he and I fought for. I think I have most of my scores and scores of letters from him. We were fighting all the time, but I loved the man. I mean, well, I'd say, where's the reference? Give me that,
Yeah.
Because here I am.
He was beyond all that stuff.
I know. Here I am.
This is the way Pike was, and my friend Arturo de Hoyos at the House of the Temple in Washington he has this life's work that he is attempting that will go on forever, I'm sure. He is slowly making his way through Pike's Morals and Dogma, attempting to figure out all of the references that Pike used when he wrote it. And because at the House of the Temple they have Pike's personal library there, they see where all the bookmarks are and where he marked pages, and Art is trying to find where every single one of these references came from.
Well, I'm glad somebody's doing that.
Yeah, since Pike didn't bother.
No, he didn't. God bless him, but he did.
I hate to say it. No, I'll say this. There was I'm all over Masonic internet forums all the time, and there was a gentleman that he and I have batting a friendly argument back and forth, and he made the contention that writers like Pike and others, especially during the Romantic period, most of the writings were not necessarily meant to be sat down and read and studied. They were actually extensions of their public orations. What they were really doing was writing down what they would use in a speech, and in those days it wasn't uncommon for somebody to give a 2-hour speech someplace. And so his contention was that these men would write this stuff down, but it was never necessarily meant for others to study over it and use it as reference, and so they didn't worry about making attribution where they got their ideas from, and that these books, these long 800-page books like Moral and Dogma, were meant more to inspire than to be actually truthful and factual. Mm-hmm. I don't know whether I buy that or not. It certainly explains a lot, but
well, at times I've made that mistake when you're because sometimes when you're put in a situation like when I was at the State Department or something like that, and they're pushing you on certain information, and you don't have your references with you, and they don't care about that. They want an answer.
Sure, yeah.
And so you're bound to, you might get most of it right, but you can't remember everything, darn it. Now, but we do remember something. We got to take a break. Our guest is Christopher Hodapp. The book is Solomon's Builders, Freemasons, Founding Fathers, and the Secrets of Washington, D.C.
I'm Joe Sobrin, author of Alias Shakespeare, and you're listening to Dr. Bob Hieronimus on 21st Century Radio.
Our guest, of course, is Christopher Hodapp. The book is Solomon's Builders, Freemasons, Founding Fathers, and the Secrets of Washington, D.C., Ulysses Press. Go to Hodapps, HODAPPS.com. Do we think it's important? Yes, we do. That's why we repeat this title so many times. We want to make sure you folks get a chance to get a couple copies because you really will enjoy this book. Christopher, what was the Age of Enlightenment, and how was Masonry the firstborn son of the Enlightenment?
Well, again, as we talked about before, the Enlightenment was a period of great upheaval in philosophy and turning the status quo on its ear. When the kings ruled by divine right and churches were the church was run by the Pope and a very strict hierarchy of church officials, and particularly in countries like France, where the church had tremendous influence over the government, and things like the church really up until the last century. In France, the church controlled most of the schools in the country. So this was the sort of thing that the members of the Enlightenment, or the believers in the Enlightenment philosophies, were rebelling against or questioning, and they started from a scientific point of view, saying that if you can determine how the world works, how the universe works through the scientific method, why can't you ask those same kinds of questions about the way society is running? and suddenly they found themselves on the opposite side of the people that believed in kings and churches running things, and the rest of you sit down and shut up. When the French king sent troops in to bust up a Masonic meeting in Paris in the 1730s, they found the most terrifying situation they could possibly have stumbled into. They found shopkeepers, members of the nobility, landowners, and even a black trumpeter from the palace all sitting together in a Masonic lodge, and they were voting on who was going to be the officer. You just didn't vote in the 1730s. That's not something that common people were allowed to do. And so this is one of the reasons why Freemasonry got a bad rap in many countries, and certainly in an ongoing pitched battle with the Catholic Church over over the rights of man. Oh gosh, I've forgotten his name. I've forgotten which pope it is. Leo XIII issued his encyclical against the Freemasons, said that he railed against the Freemasons as a bunch of so-called free thinkers who had the temerity to believe that the common people should control their own destiny. Mm-hmm. So if he found Masonic philosophy that terrifying, he must have found things like the U.S. Constitution as absolutely pornographic.
Well, it must be, no doubt about it, because this is another great section in your book. I mean, there are a lot of real gems dealing with the Gutenberg printing press. Now, you say this so clearly. Well, what effect did Gutenberg's printing press have on the church and the state? I know many of our listeners are going to be shocked to learn that most people, even didn't have a Bible, weren't even allowed to read the Bible. People
couldn't read because, number one, they didn't have anything to read, so there was no point in reading. The only commonly circulated book among any class, really, up until the late Renaissance, was the Bible. Reading material was something that you kept in the Medici's private library or in monasteries, where they were all hand-copied very slowly and slowly matriculated, and were hugely expensive. To have a library in 1600, to have a private library, was unheard of just because of the sheer expense involved. When Gutenberg's printing press suddenly made it fast, cheap, and easy to distribute printed matter, he knew that the one way that he would get his invention sold across Europe was to print a Bible, because it was the one thing nobody could really argue with. If you printed a Bible, nobody could argue with you circulating that. Well, sure they could, because the church wasn't too crazy about common people reading the Bible. This is why Latin held on as the official language of the Bible right up until you had lead-ups to the King James version of the Bible that were published, but the concept of publishing a Bible in the vernacular across Europe, in German or English or Spanish and so forth, was just an anathema, because you weren't supposed to be able to read that. That was something that the church was supposed to be making. They were supposed to tell you what that meant. They were supposed to read it to you and explain the significance of it. So the printing press turned the world upside down.
And as you said, this one paragraph on page 41, I've got to read part of it. The mass of humanity in Western society had always gotten its news and information through the channels of power, carefully filtered through the proper authority. An English translation of the Bible in the hands of every man was a terrifying image for a typical bishop or cardinal of the period. Kings and electors were similarly unnerved by political tracts in the hands of the masses. At hand was the dawn of a new age in which political authorities found themselves at war with a machine. Yes, that says it so clearly. I mean, the common man really was not supposed to be sitting down reading the Bible.
We're living through this again now, as newspapers are closing left and right, and the old traditional forms of news gathering and dissemination of news have fallen by the wayside, and people are turning into the box in the corner of their office or their living room, and they're looking on the internet, and they're finding news where they want it.
Now, Christopher, how had Freemasonry figured out how to run a democratic society and make it work?
Well, Freemasonry, anyone that's ever been, you don't necessarily have to be a Mason, but anyone who's ever belonged to a modern organization that elects its own officers and elects new members understands how all of that works, and we take that for granted these days. But at the time, in the early to mid 1700s, this was radical stuff, and having people across all different classes, all different economic lines, voting and deciding on their officers, and amending their rules and changing their bylaws and this sort of thing. This was unheard of, and yet this was really radical, new kinds of thinking to have an organization that did that. The Freemasons, when Dr. James Anderson sat down or the Reverend James Anderson sat down and wrote what were called Anderson's Constitutions in the 1720s, they were a collection of rules that were based on rules that were found in very, very old documents. There's a 16th or a 15th century document called the Regis Manuscript that contains the rules that controlled the medieval stonemasons guild, and how they would initiate new members, and how they would elect their officers and this sort of thing within their organization. It was really one of the first labor unions. And so Anderson and the Freemasons in the 1700s took those ideas and applied them in a more modern way in terms of how you set up an organization that not only was just a group of 15 or 20 guys meeting in London, but something that eventually, in a very, very short time, spread all around the world. And yet you had this central organization that was in charge of chartering new lodges. They enforced regulations on how you brought new members in. They enforced how the ritual that was used for doing that, the ritual ceremonies. They had to standardize those. They had to come up with what they referred to as a provincial government for Freemasonry, in terms of you would have representatives that went to the American colonies, that went to the Caribbean, that went to the Oriental colonies, or the African colonies that were growing, and so you have this representative government that was working very, very well for the Freemasons, and had been working very, very well for about 60 years before you get to 1776. So here you have a working model of representative government that's egalitarian, that's based on voting, that's based on democratic principles, which is something that really hadn't existed in the world since Greek and Roman times.
And, of course, there's democracies, if you would want to call them that, or at least representative form of governments, are paled in comparison to the republic that we have in America. And we're going to have to stop there. We'll come back with our guest, Christopher Hodapp, Solomon's Builders, Freemasons, Founding Fathers, and Secrets of Washington, D.C., Ulysses Press, Hodapps.com. Well, welcome back to 21st Century Radio. This is the alleged Dr. Bob Hieronimus, a lowly Ph.D., hanging out in this part of the universe. And sometimes I know where I am. Lots of times I don't. Our executive producer and research assistant, who is my boss, who makes sure that I got to do things right many times, is Laura Cordner. And, of course, our engineer is Jake Bryant. Our guest for the next 20-some minutes is Christopher Hodapp, Solomon's Builders, Freemasons, Founding Fathers, and the Secrets of Washington, D.C., Ulysses Press. Go to Hodapps, HODAPPS.com. Chapter 4, War Among Brothers, contains some Freemasons who impacted America in their struggle. Of course, you discuss Edmund Burke and Paul Revere, Dr. Joseph Warren. But tell us about I was going to say James Galloway, but tell us about Major General Gilbert Lafayette.
Sure. General Gilbert Lafayette, one of the famed heroes of the Revolution, decided when Benjamin Franklin came to Paris looking for experienced military men to come and help the colonial army, Lafayette was fascinated by the very concept of the formation of America, and so at the age of 19, he actually joined the military very, very young, when he was 15 or 16, and so at the age of 19, he decides to come and help the United States. The king of France briefly decided that he really didn't want a bunch of French officers going over there to help the Americans. He thought that might bring down the reign of terror from the British on them, and so Lafayette stole away in the night. He snuck out on a ship, and ships chased him all the way across the Atlantic to try and stop him, he and several friends that came over. And when he appeared in Philadelphia announcing that Franklin had promised him he could be a general, Congress looked at him like the dog talked and went, who's this kid? And Washington took to him almost immediately, and he became one of Washington's most trusted generals in a very short period of time. And Lafayette would go back to France eventually and work out more military aid for the United States for the colonies, and over the years there have been discussions on Lafayette's Masonic membership. There are many that thought that he joined an American military lodge, but evidence has come out that he actually joined a lodge in Paris shortly before he came to America. After that, he went back. He became part of the civil government in France. He actually was at the Bastille when the Bastille was stormed at the beginning of the French Revolution. He kept the mob from tearing apart the royal family when they were there. And throughout the course of the French Revolution, things went back and forth many, many times in terms of who was on the right side of the revolution, and they killed the vast majority of the revolutionary leaders over the course of the revolution, and he was clapped into prison. His wife joined him in prison. It's a fascinating life that Lafayette led. And after the revolution in France died down, he came back to the United States and toured the country in the early 1800s, and he was hailed as a hero everywhere he went. And in fact, he so loved America that when he died in France and was buried in Paris, he asked to be buried under American soil, and so a load of dirt from the United States was taken there and was placed over his grave. And interestingly, his grave was the only place in Paris under the Nazi occupation that the American flag was allowed to fly without being touched. The American flag flies over his grave today.
That's remarkable. That is. I just learned so much in this. There's so many things you touched on. That one area in which his wife, it was Adrian. Yeah. She went to Austria with her children. They begged for Lafayette's release, and when the Holy Roman Emperor refused, she and the girls joined him in prison. His prison cell. They lived with him in prison for 2 years.
Yeah.
God, what a story!
Yeah, it's an incredible story. And,
now, why?
Again, it's one of those things that's sort of lost to Americans. We don't know about that anymore. But at the time when he came back to the United States and spent like a year and a half touring the United States after the French Revolution, the excitement of Lafayette coming here was just unbelievable. He was hailed as such a hero.
Now, you also point out something but very few people do, and that is that it was a tragic irony that the debt incurred by Louis XVI in assisting America in its revolution helped bring his financial ruin to France.
Yeah, it really it helped to destroy the French economy, and was just one more thing that helped to lead to the French Revolution.
Yeah. Well, is there? Here's another area here that I just thought was so much fun. Is there any parallel between the Roslin Chapel and Roslin? I gotta ask you this.
You had to bring that one out. Okay.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. This is fun.
Look, I know the clock's ticking here, but yes, Roslin Chapel in Scotland that appears at the end of the Da Vinci Code, if that's the only place you ever heard of it, has had so much written about it in terms of its mystical origins and the carvings that are in it and all this fascinating stuff, and many have alleged that the secret treasure of the Templars may be buried in its foundations. Not there's any evidence of that, but at any rate, there is actually a Roslin Chapel just across the Potomac from Washington, D.C. You can even ride the metro there to the Roslin station, and when you get off at the Roslin station, you look across, and there is indeed a Roslin Chapel right there in front of you, and
at its very foundation,
it truly has a secret buried treasure in its foundation. Mm-hmm. When they built the church, they decided that they wanted to have a constant, steady source of income, and so they built it over a gas station, and it has subterranean tanks filled with gasoline. And I can't think of a better treasure to have with oil prices being what they are.
Yeah, well, after noting the name Solomon is related to the Hebrew Shalom and the Arabic Suleiman, I hope I pronounced that correctly, both linked to peaceful or complete, might this mean that the title of your book, Solomon's Builders, can be viewed as builders of peace or completion?
I love that. I love that you say that. Yes, that is absolutely the way that I view Freemasonry. That they really are. The Masons are builders of peace. That it cuts across all political, social, religious lines, and brings men together without the things that divide them.
Well, that's why it strikes me so deeply concerning the fundamentalist conspiratorial interpretations of Freemasonry, in which their charges are exactly the opposite of what Freemasonry is about.
Yeah.
And the fact that the History Channel would allow that to happen and let it stand is a bit more than I can stand.
I know. Hopefully it won't be rerun.
Now, I understand you. I understand. Well, if it's not
rerun... You and I both know that it will. But...
Yeah, it will. Yeah, that'll be shown 1,000 times.
Yeah.
I mean, I did shows with them, and I'm sure you have too before.
Well, I keep seeing that show with David Icke showing up periodically. It's like, heavens, how can this be rerun?
Yeah, it's amazing. It is. That's just amazing. But you're going to be in Annapolis.
I am going to be in Annapolis. I'm going to be at Annapolis Lodge number 89, and unfortunately, it's not open to the public. It's for Master Masons only. But if you're a Freemason within the sound of my voice, come out to Annapolis Lodge. At any rate, and then in November, my new book, you had to know this was coming, Deciphering the Lost Symbol, is supposed to be out by Thanksgiving.
Oh, really? Going.
So that means I'm supposed to be writing right now, but I'm not. And so, yeah.
Well, good going. I look forward to reading it. Christopher, thank you so much, not only for joining us, but for educating me in other areas that I certainly needed educating in. And it's been quite a joy reading your stuff and watching you in action.
Well, thank you very, very much. It was a tremendous pleasure to be on the show with you, and I always wanted to meet you. We almost crossed paths in the hotel when we were working on that dumb show, and so this has been a great opportunity to speak with you, and I appreciate it.
Thank you, Christopher. Now, Christopher Hodapp, Solomon's Builders, Freemasons, Founding Fathers, and the Secrets of Washington, D.C., Ulysses Press, Hodapp's, HODAPPS.com. This is one of the most important books in this field you need for your library. 21st Century Radio is produced by Hieronimus and Company, and our executive producer and research assistant is Laura Kortner. I'm Dr. Bob Hieronimus, and remember to get a haircut.